All right, well, thank you for joining us for our next episode of our small group study. We're going to be in the book of Judges today, so Chad, would you go ahead and read for us?
Sure, chapter 1, starting at verse 1. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand, and given the land." And Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. And they found Adonai-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites.
All right, so as we begin the book of Judges, they're still trying to drive out the Canaanites. And this is going to turn into a really big problem because really what Israel does is they never really finish the job. They never really do what God had called them to do. And now, do you see any parallels here to the story of the book of Judges where God calls them to drive out the Canaanites? They don't drive out the Canaanites. And then the Canaanites end up becoming a pretty big stumbling block for them. Do you see any parallels to that in, say, the beginning of Genesis?
Yeah, so obviously, Adam is supposed to work and keep the garden.
Mm-hmm.
And that word keep can kind of be looked at as guard and things
Right.
of this sort as well. And so might be good if you kept that serpent out of the garden.
Right.
And not keeping that serpent out of the garden obviously opened the door to some pretty dire consequences.
Yeah, this seems to be, again, there. Once you understand the Bible, there's a few patterns and a few stories that get expanded on more and more, but the bones of the story is still the same. And this is an important one where God is really clear with Adam about what his job really is, and that is you need to keep the things out of the garden that don't belong there. And his failure to do so is what causes the fall. And you see that same thing coming up over and over again. You have to keep things out of the garden. You have to keep things out that don't belong. And if you don't, that will cause your downfall. And so this is something that happens here on a national level, is that the Israelites fail to drive the Canaanites out. And eventually what will happen is those Canaanite practices will start looking pretty good to a lot of the Israelites and will lead them into idolatry. And that is a problem that Israel will deal with all the way up into the exile, and really won't be solved until the exile and then the return from the exile. And even then, it's kind of debatable whether it was actually solved or just transferred to something else. But from a personal standpoint, do you see any personal application to this principle?
Oh, absolutely. I'm reminded of God's words to Cain in Genesis, where he talks about sin crouching at the door, and there's a lot of truth in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sin is crouching at the door, and you can't give it a foothold in any area of your life. And I was talking to a friend recently who's making some compromises, and I just said, look, either your actions are going to conform to your beliefs, or your beliefs are going to conform to your actions, and you need to be careful. And, he said, well, if I pay some consequences down the road, I'm prepared to pay those.
The first time that we encounter something, a lot of times we're like, hey, I'm not going to do that. I'm not interested. But if we leave it close enough to us long enough, that seems to be the problem. We're not as ruthless as we need to be in keeping things out of our life that need to be out of our life. And so I think that there is a real principle here that we can learn from this. Now, the result of this throughout the book of Judges is moral corruption. And really one of the things that makes the book of Judges kind of difficult reading is there's not a lot of the feelings of the reader are not spared in the description of the moral corruption that goes on here. Now, what is the result of that moral corruption for Israel?
I mean, you can go from the beginning of Judges to the end, and you just don't feel like Israel got anywhere. Mm-hmm. They'll run well for a season with a good judge, and then mm-hmm. when that judge dies, they'll deteriorate and often be subject to tyranny, and it's just over and over, and you just don't feel like through hundreds of years of history, like they actually made progress.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I think that you could make a good argument that what you see is a slow and there's quick decline and slow decline at the same time. That there is a cycle that Israel will go through. Their moral corruption will lead them to quick declines, and then they'll be saved. And so you look like you're just turning a circle. You look like you're not making any progress. It's like running around a track. You're right back where you started.
But you think it's a downhill spiral.
But there's a bigger story to this where each judge actually gets a little bit worse. Each salvation is a little bit less complete until you reach the end of the book, and the end of the book is just shocking. It really is shocking how bad things get. So the cycle seems to be in the book of Judges is that there is sin in Israel, and then they become oppressed by a foreign power, and then they cry out to God. He raises up a deliverer, and then they experience some salvation and peace. And is there any parallels to that in Israel's history? I mean, is this the first time they're experiencing this pattern, or are there other times in their history where this pattern seems to be apparent?
And you mean previous to this?
Well, previous to that, or even later.
Pretty much.
Pretty much
go
the
down
whole
the
thing.
line. Yeah. I mean, this is not unique to them, right? This is
Yeah.
a microcosm, or of us as individuals, as peoples. I mean, this is This is human history.
No, I think that this is exactly the way that it works, and it works if we're honest with ourselves in our own life. We've seen this cycle over and over and over again. I know people who have had substance abuse problems and have been in this scenario where they sin. It's fun at first, and then pretty soon this problem is oppressing them. They cry out for deliverance, and they get some deliverance. And then there's a time of peace, but sometimes, unfortunately, what's happened in their lives is that they will slide back into this. Now, this cycle sometimes has to happen multiple times in their life before they finally go, hey, there's never not going to be a time where I can sin and find myself under oppression. So finally, I will connect the two, and I will stay away from this particular sin. But even in my own life, I mean, there's so many times where, whether it's being impatient or whatever, I will say, this has gotten out of hand, I need to work on it. And you will, and then you'll start getting some freedom from it, and then you go, I don't have to worry about this anymore, and then it won't take long before this happens. And this scales up to the national, I mean, you can look at the Roman Empire or anything, really. It doesn't really matter what the sin is. This is always the pattern. Anytime we engage in sin, this is always the pattern. So why do you think it's so hard for us to learn that this is the pattern?
That's a great question. I mean, I think if we're willing to admit it sometimes that there are certain sins that we do find attractive. I can recall having a friend who had a drinking problem, and if he was going to have one drink, he was going to have a dozen, and it all culminated in one disastrous night that had really, long-term effects in his life that were destructive, and I remember talking to him a year later. He went cold turkey, no drinking for a year, and I remember talking to him a year later, and he's like, "So Chad, I decided that I think I might start, trying to have some alcohol again." And he's like, "Do you think it's a sin for me to have alcohol?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't think the Bible says it's a sin to drink in general, but for you it might be."
Yeah.
And it was one of those things, like one was going to lead to 12, and 12 was going to lead to disaster, and
Right.
and it's one of those things. But it was an attractive sin in his mind,
Right.
And one he didn't want to stay away from.
Yeah, that's the problem, is that, from a biblical perspective, the engagement of sin is really the worship of a foreign god. It's really the worship of something. It's to have a value out of order. It's to make a certain value a god in your life. And we do that because first of all, we trust in that God. We trust that God to bring us glory. And secondly, because we love that God. And love and trust are two really big aspects of worship that you see throughout the Bible. And one of the things that's really interesting is we kind of feel like we can worship God through obedience and just kind of grit our teeth and do our duty. That's really when God calls us to worship, we can duty worship God. But the Bible doesn't really understand that perspective. That really in order to worship God, you have to give God your love and your trust. And so there's really a choice that's always before us, and that is, are you going to love and trust God, or are you going to love and trust something else? And when you love and trust something other than the God of the Bible, you're always going to end up in oppression.